it's Drybear. The time has finally come. We're going to cover the Perforator today as we continue our series covering all of the weapons in the First Descendant. Now, this weapon was previously looked at as one of the better weapons in the game, and unfortunately, after running the numbers, it is good, but it definitely doesn't rock my socks on that front, especially after the ridiculous buff that the Nizastra's Devotion, the other ultimate hand cannon, got. It makes this one a little bit more pale in comparison. First, let's talk about the pure raw DPS build for this weapon, and this is going to be optimizing its uptime and usage. So if you want to use it as your primary weapon, you like the weapon, you like the look of it, it does have an awesome sound on the fire for it. It's super enjoyable, super satisfying. If you want to use it as your main weapon, this is the build that will bring out the optimal DPS from it if it's going to be in your hand for long periods of time. You can see that the theoretical or simulated DPS is 705k, which means it does fall short of a couple of the best purples in the game, like Tamer, Eternal Willpower, Silly Weeper, or even the Unwelcomed from the tactical rifles all outperform this weapon, and those are being purple weapons as well. That being said, I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity for this to be used as a sidearm, and we'll talk about that in build in a minute as we focus on that. Let's recover this because I still get questions on my videos on how this works. So let's talk about what it is that you're looking at right now and how to use it. Underneath my head, this build here is the build that will give you the most amount of DPS that this weapon can possibly dish out in the current state of the game. However, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the most comfortable for you, and so you might want to work in more accuracy, more recoil, movement while aiming, whatever else that you want in your build to make the gun feel better for you, since the best weapon for you is always going to be the weapon that feels the best over long play sessions. So if you wanted to work in accuracy, these modules down here are ordered by how much they provide to the weapon, and you go to the left side, you can see their stat weightings, their power weightings relative to other options. So if you wanted to work in some bonus to recoil improvement or some accuracy improvement to make the gun feel better for you, you would just go down the list, find the lowest one in here, which would be weak point sight, for example, swap that out for Hawkeye or vibration absorption if you want to make the gun feel better, and you would only lose a small portion of the overall DPS output for that. So we're still going to run real life fighter, rifling reinforcement, and action and reaction. I can't get away from these mods. They're just too good. They work on everything, and the problem is firearm attack as a global unmitigated scaler is just so insanely good. It makes everything the weapon does better, which means that maxing out your firearm attack becomes your #1 priority on any weapon, regardless of the stats that it has. But it also has decent crit damage and decent crit scaling as well. So we're going to run better concentration, target detection, and better insight. All of the crit chance bonuses in purple modules are almost always a DPS loss unless you have like an Enzo buff on you 24/7. So just straight out of the gate, almost all Descendants, in most cases, you never want to run like Edging Shot, any of those. They end up being a DPS loss because they lower things like firearm attack, which not only make your crits worse, but they also make everything else worse, which is really painful. We're on fire rate up and have aiming and weak point sight, and then of course we're going to run with our elemental enhancement versus weakness. Again, this mod performs so much better than any other elemental bonus in the game because this mod specifically, which is different than any other elemental bonus in the game, scales off of your firearm attack. So the more firearm attack you have, the better the elemental enhancement gets. So toxic enhancement, fire enhancement, those sorts of things. Because it scales off firearm attack, it makes it hugely valuable for almost any weapon build in the entire game. Then for our reroll priority and stat priority, we want bonus versus attack. Most likely Colossus is going to be the best here. So bonus versus Colossus, firearm attack, crit damage, and flat elemental damage of any kind is going to be your best rolls on this. But you could replace flat elemental damage with crit chance. Overall, it'll be a lower improvement for damage, but it will mean you'll crit slightly more often, and sometimes people really like that in general. And also keep in mind that this is a rounds 0% weighting weapon, which means that pretty much any weapon under a round count of like 8 is not going to get any value from the rounds reload because it caps out at 12%, and it does round down. It floors the value when you add rounds, which means that for the Perforator at base with no modifications, if you get a max golden roll on rounds, you won't get any more rounds. So it's a 0% weighting on the reroll stats there. But that is the basic DPS for the weapon. But let's talk about the other option, which I think is going to be the better option for the Perforator rather than just running as pure DPS, because I think there are other options in the game that would be better to be as your primary damage dealing weapon. First, let's talk talk about the passive for the weapon, the unique ability. This one will stun targets if you break their shields, but has a really nice bonus of being able to deal damage to a target's shield. It does less and less depending on what targets it's shooting, and has a lower proc rate as well. But against commanders and Colossus, you still have a decent proc rate, and it will do a decent amount of damage. So I would actually, instead of running this Perforator as your main DPS weapon, which is fine to do, it's definitely in the top 10% of weapons in the game for main damage, I would run it as a sidearm. When what I mean by that is that you would bring it out when you're shooting a target that has an active shield, or when you just need some burst damage done to weak point, but it's not your main DPS throughput weapon. You have a throughput weapon, which is in your main hand, you know, like a rifle or machine gun or something like that, and then you switch over to the Perforator when you're shooting a Colossus that's fresh and has a shield active, or a commander or an elite, burn the shield down, switch back to your main weapon, or if you just get a chance, like the Colossus get down, you want some burst damage to go into their weak point, while you know you can get very high weak point accuracy because they're stunned or something like that. As you max out the unique ability, the accuracy loss goes to 0, which is nice, and the amount of damage you do to shields goes up, and in some cases you get some minor modifications there as well, and of course you still get the stun on targets that can be stunned if you break their shield. Now, actually, the weapon at base, even with modifiers on it, isn't really bad enough to warrant too many modifications. The biggest thing is the recoil is pretty high, super satisfying sound when you shoot it. I actually love it when you shoot this weapon, and the recoil is pretty high, but just like Nazestra's, it's kind of up. It's almost straight up and a little bit to the right, and the accuracy loss is kind of minimal, but you can run some minor accuracy increases if you really wanted to. You can even have a non-catalyzed slot with a partially upgraded Hawkeye if you wanted to save yourself an extra crystallization catalyst. But what I mean by having a weapon that is a sidearm, that you focus on some of these time-limited modules like Dopaminergic Activate. So Dopaminergic Activate or Weak Point Expansion are both great options because they have really low uptime. They're actually not, they're active for a single bullet in many cases, and then they go on cooldown, then they come off cooldown, you get to use them again for a single bullet, then they go on cooldown. Because they have such limited uptime, their overall DPS throughput is very low compared to other things like Real Life Fighter, Sharp Precision Shot, which currently does not work on hand cannon, so you can't use that as an option, Mental Focus, those kinds of modules. Even Elemental Conductor outperforms these mods in a pure uptime scenario because they are active all the time, and while they go up and down in value, they never actually reach 0, which Dopaminergic and Weak Point Expansion reach 0. You get one shot, then they turn off completely for 4.5 seconds, and then they come back on. So that downtime is really what limits the usage of these modules. However, if you don't plan on using the weapon as an overall throughput weapon, like a high uptime weapon, then the value of these modules goes up because you can switch to the weapon, use that big burst of damage on a target when you have an opportunity, then switch back to your normal DPS weapon, and overall you get some nice burst damage out of it as well. This even opens up some opportunities for Payout, which again is another low uptime module. It's active for 3 seconds, then it goes on cooldown for 5 times that time to just do nothing in that period. But again, if you're only going to use this for a single magazine, or maybe like just a little bit over a single magazine, things like Payout, Weak Point Expansion, and the like Dopaminergic Activate, their value goes way up because you're not using that time where it's 0, you're using the time where it's great, and then you're switching to another weapon that's better for throughput DPS. So when it comes to using this weapon as like a burst sidearm that you switch to in moments where it makes sense, this is what I would recommend. This is the sidearm shield build for the Perforator, and it's built to basically use about a magazine or maybe a magazine and a half, but no more. You don't really want to be keeping this weapon out for a long period of time. In fact, if you can use it exactly as a magazine or slightly less than that, that's going to be the most optimal. So you switch to this weapon, you slam it out, shoot out as much as you can, get some damage out, and then switch back to your main weapon. And there's 2 main reasons for this. You get a nice increase in the DPS output because you're going to be able to use the uptime for these things like Dopaminergic Activate. By the way, if you look at the left side of the screen, if you use it for less uptime, Action and Reaction actually becomes your best module, but then Dopaminergic Activate, Weak Point Expansion, Special Sight, all of these come up in value because your uptime is not as reliant on that. So Dopaminergic is actually the biggest value gain for this. Even if you're slamming directly into weak point, it's still better because the crit chance and crit damage on this weapon is so good. So we run Dopaminergic as our main. We still run Rifling Reinforcement and Action Reaction. Fire rate becomes a lot more valuable because we're trying to get as much in that small window of time as as we can. Then we have aiming, weak point sight, better concentration, target detection, and reload expert. In this case, because our damage in that moment matters more, better insight becomes a lot less valuable, mainly because it's such a small value add to the crit chance overall. You're better off with things like, you can use this for a single one, but actually having that firearm attack inside of that, because the base firearm for Perforator is so incredibly good, ends up being even just 1% firearm attack makes a huge difference in the overall damage output. But it's very close on some of these. You could run potentially like Recycling Genius if you want to do 2 magazines instead of 1, just to have a little bit more value out of that. But again, the more you spend past the first magazine, dopaminergic and things like that start to lose value. But weak point expansion is a little bit worse than dopaminergic. You can also run with special sight if you wanted to, but my recommendation would be dopaminergic, especially if you're going against weak point, because you have those nice crits scaling up on that. The stat priority changes slightly. We get a little bit more value on crit damage, a little bit more value on flat elemental damage. The crit chance value goes down a little bit because we're not going to be taking as many chances against crit chance, and so if we have less uptime, you have less opportunities to crit, and so that small increase to crit chance doesn't have as much value in a shorter period of time, so we're going to have that go down, but we still have some extra value there, and of course it's still going to be a 0% weighting for rounds. So that would be my recommendation for Perforator. If you want to use it as a main DPS, you certainly can. It's going to get outperformed from the top 5 purple weapons in the game, and get outperformed by a lot of the other ultimate weapons in the game. It's still very good at 705k. I would still put it in the top ranking for single target DPS and damage output, and it does have a nice shield break on it as well. But my recommendation for this specific weapon would be to run it as like a quick switch weapon that you swap over to. You use this as your sidearm shield breaker, switch back to your main weapon when it's just DPS time. By the way, anytime you use anything as a quick swap weapon, you can run the modules that increase weapon swap speed. That gives you a small DPS increase as well, and probably feels a lot better. And you can swap out reload expert in this case that we're just using for a little firearm attack in order to get that bonus in there. But you could swap this for weapon swap speed. You could swap it for a tiny amount of crit chance, something like that. But this is what I would recommend for the weapon. Let me know what you think about the Perforator down below and what weapon we should cover next. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.